I am obsessed. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a day, I'm doom scrolling. I just have to have the very latest information on what's happening with Donald Trump, with tariffs, with firings. I can't get enough of it, it seems. But obviously, I've had too much of it. My anxiety levels have never been higher. And I know that it is a direct result of what is going on. It's not only all the news and all the bad news, it's the misinformation, it's the divisiveness, it's the arguing, it's the fear over what this is going to lead to. And I bet you can probably relate to this. This episode, we're going to look at the actual damage that doom scrolling is doing to our mental health. The Canada Research Chair in Neuroscience will join me later to talk about the impact this current news cycle, coupled with social media, is having on the wiring of our brains, especially in youth. But first, a psychologist who specializes in mood and anxiety will join me. The news. We are under attack. This episode of the Mental Health Podcast. Dr. Lauren Flavel is a colleague of mine here at the Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health Sciences. She is a psychologist and the Regional Clinical and Training Lead for the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program. Well, hi, Dr. Flavel. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It is a compulsion of mine now, and it is really draining me, and it is playing on my anxiety, which in turn plays on my depression. And that is the latest news that is going on. And of course, the highlight is what's going on with the tariffs and the White House, but there's also what's going on in the Middle East. And it's just bombarding us. And I have noticed that I'm feeling much more anxious. Am I alone?
You are absolutely not alone in this, Kevin. I would also add, anxiety is just one response to being inundated with, we'll call it bad news. But there's also, a lot of grief and sadness. There's a lot of rage and frustration, anxiety, but also stress, overwhelm. And probably a lot of us are in kind of that freeze response a little bit, kind of watching our phones and our TVs. And to your point, it feels like it's everywhere. So absolutely not alone.
And you know what else plays on me is the misinformation, because you yell at your screen, that's not true. And you know it's not true. And this misinformation, when someone says this is black, but you can see it's white, that is incredibly frustrating. But is it adding to the anxiety?
And I think, in addition to misinformation, the language that's being used is very divisive, very catastrophic. So absolutely, I would also say it's hard to keep up with misinformation when it was just the sheer amount of information that's coming at us. I think journalists are trying to keep up, and we see in the news, a couple days later, some of the fact checking, but it's very hard to keep up with, and it's all at once. And so even if there's misinformation, it's hard to always decipher what's going on and what's real and what's not. So it's really scary, and I'm sure that contributes to a lot of anxiety, Kevin. Absolutely.
And I know what psychologists are going to say. They're going to say, okay, you got to be more mindful. So you've got to realize, wait a minute, this is happening there, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But in reality, it is so hard to do that because you are constantly being bombarded from all sides of any issue. What's happening to us, and what's happening to us generally as a society, so let's just call it a unified brain. What's happening to us, and how important is it that we find a way to resolve this?
Yeah, and we could talk about what's happening to us, and that would take several hours. But I think from a psychologist perspective, one thing that I'm really noticing is, again, just as a collective, to be totally overwhelmed with information. And if you think about the nature of what our brains like to do, is they like to predict, they like to have certainty, we like to understand where we're going and what direction life is taking us. And so to have such uncertainty and chaos, and to have it at our fingertips on our phones, is really disruptive. And I think our brains trying to predict the future, and get that certainty, it's causing a lot of stress. And so, to your point, mindfulness is just one way, but I think for all of us to really ground ourselves into some coping skills and to challenge what our brains, that kind of chaotic, needing to know, it's like we're going to have to take a different approach in this type of environment in order for us to protect our mental health.
Okay, now are you going to tell me the beginning is don't look at the internet so much?
It's actually interesting, Kevin. So yes, absolutely. It's going to be being mindful of how much of this you're consuming, especially because it's everywhere. So to your point, like when I was growing up, I didn't have it delivered to my phone, but now it's kind of everywhere, the news. So it's being mindful about limiting it, but I also would say that avoiding the news completely, depending on who you are and kind of what's helpful for you, but that might not also be the best scenario.
And
so
and
when
you also
we
then you get into the FOMO, the fear of missing out,
you're
as
missing
well,
out.
and then
And
that
to your
drives your
point,
anxiety.
and even if it's not FOMO, it's like you probably should be a little informed on everything that's going on. It might have impacts on you. And so to kind of put our heads totally in the sand is not what we're looking to do, but also to be doom scrolling late at night in bed, probably isn't great for us either. A healthy middle ground.
Yeah, that is very true. And if you can achieve that, where would you start with someone who came to you and said, this is dominating my life, and I know it, and I'm just so fearful now for the future because we're told that all of this is going to have a major crash at some point. I mean, no one can say it with real certainty, but we keep hearing the warnings. Where do I start? Doc, tell me, where do I start?
Well, and first of all, I mean, I think this is the benefit of if you have access to having your own supports and your own therapist, only because this is going to be different for people depending on kind of the way that their brain works, depending on the actual circumstances that they're in, and kind of who you are, your social location, what you do for work, and everything like that. So, but just in some broad strokes, one of the things that I'd say helps me as a therapist also, in addition to some of my clients, is to really identify productive versus unproductive worries. So the key thing here is that we cannot say that thinking in the worst case scenarios is necessarily biased or inaccurate or jumping to conclusions. Like we are seeing some pretty catastrophic outcomes, and some pretty scary stuff. So we don't want to invalidate what is valid. We don't want to undermine, like your anxiety has a purpose here. You have an anxiety system that's built for times like this because it's like, hey, red alert, this is scary. And so in order to decipher kind of which are the real problems, the things that are happening and are productive worries versus those that are more maybe hypothetical or extreme, unproductive worries. So the key is productive is that the problem is here, it's happened, or it's very, very likely to happen in the near future, and there's something you can do about it. Versus you can imagine the unproductive ones are the problem's not here yet, or it's kind of a hypothetical worry, a worst case scenario, or there is actually a problem in front of us, but there's nothing you can do about it. And so if you have some thoughts, it might start to be deciphering kind of which are your productive and which are your unproductive, because you treat them very differently.
Okay, let's take one scenario then that's happened in the last little bit. Let's go to the Oval Office yelling match or shouting match between Ukrainian President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance. And I don't want to take any sides here on this one, okay? But both sides could come away from that, watching that, with anxiety. Both, anybody who agrees with Trump, anybody who agrees with Zelensky. So what do I do? I'm not in that meeting. I'm never going to be able to talk to Trump or Zelensky. I'd love to, but where do I start? How do I is that a productive thought or an unproductive one? And how do I make it productive?
Yeah, and not to get too nosy, but what's the thought? What's the fear? I mean, I have my own, but what are yours?
I think just that it happened. We've never seen anything like that. So on one side, you have the thought, I can't believe they ambushed him. On the other side, you have the thought, I can't believe he didn't wear a suit into the meeting. So the thoughts are almost a helplessness of watching this transpire and the fact that it actually happened. I can't believe it. Most people can't believe it to this point. How do I process that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, that in itself isn't necessarily a future worry. So maybe the unproductive, productive doesn't work as well there. I think when you're feeling helpless and watching something like that, and there definitely can be worries from it. It's just, first, it's radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is the idea that we often fight and have tension against things that we don't like or don't agree with, and we try to find a way to kind of say, why it's so unfair. I can't believe this. And as much as that's absolutely valid, like we are not in the position to do much about this. And so radical acceptance means I take things as they are. I accept that things are the way that they are. It doesn't mean I like it. It doesn't mean I approve of it. It doesn't mean I accept it or endorse it. And I think that Oval Office encounter is evidence that, things like that might happen again, of concerns around Trump and Putin. And I think it gives some evidence to, we might see this stuff again. And so that, to me, there's a productive worry in there to say that this might be the direction things are going. But also remember, productive worries is something I can do something about it. So where I might go for my productive worries is that I can talk to my Ukrainian friends and clients and show my support. I can maybe get on the streets and make a sign. I can be more vocal. But I can't go to the Oval Office and make things different. And I can certainly think about how I'm going to vote here in Canada. That would be part of the productiveness of the worry, is that there's things I can do within my control to problem solve. The unproductiveness is like, again, there's a lot here that we can't change. And so that's where the radical acceptance is going to come in.
And talk me through that acceptance, because it to me is still it would be difficult to do. So talk me through, how do I accept something that I have no control over, but that is still so radically different than what we've seen before?
Yeah, Kevin, and it's why we call it radical acceptance. It's a radical act to not fight against reality. So we, again, are not saying that this is okay or that you want it to continue. And radical acceptance doesn't mean necessarily that you have to sit down and be inactive or passive. But radical acceptance means that we don't mentally try and create a different outcome in our heads that isn't here. And it's this kind of really extreme understanding that the way things have played out have already played out. And that fighting against it is only going to hurt ourselves and cause a state of anxiety or grief or frustration. And that if we're going to be active and problem solving to the best of our abilities, is that we don't need that hindrance of being in tension with ourselves about what's actually happening. So it's kind of like just really kind of settling into, it's happened, it's here. How does that inform what we do next?
Wow, you're talking about the serenity prayer. What is it? Grant me the courage to change what I can. How does it go? The courage to accept and the wisdom to accept things I can't. Something along those lines. And I apologize to everyone who's yelling right now at their earbuds. Oh, come on, Kevin, it's this. So, but it really does talk about wisdom and courage. So I can change this I
Yeah.
can't change this and I need to accept it. And I think that's really, it's a hard thing to do, but it definitely is a very good piece of advice.
Yeah, and I think at the end it's the wisdom to know the difference, and that's what we're talking about here, which is
I think
like,
that's it. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
let's change what we can. Let's lean into that. Let's be brave, and stand up for what you believe, and get your voice out there, and problem solve in the ways that you can. But there's a lot here where we are going to have to learn to tolerate uncertainty. We are going to have to learn to sit with helplessness and hopelessness. Um, and that takes courage too. And it's going to be something that we're all practicing, because there's a lot here that, we're going to have to sit and just endure.
Yeah. And I guess we have to do that consciously too. We're watching this news day after day after day. So I think we kind of have to preface it every time we see something and say, listen, I'm about to see things here. And I have
Yeah.
to have that acceptance of things that happen. I may not like it, but at least I can resolve it with myself that it's not my place to be anxious about it because I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I think kind of being aware of how we engage in different emotions. You don't have to engage in every emotion that shows up at the door, but also again what we talked about, that your emotion systems are there for a reason, and these emotions are probably showing up because they make complete sense given what's going on. And so I also think that compassion piece, and honoring it, like whatever it is for you, is just like, how do I take care of myself when I'm going through something that's really, really tough? I mean, these are unprecedented times, and we all deserve a lot of grace for how we are carrying ourselves with all of this extra weight and burden.
And I had to look it up because if I didn't, I would dwell on it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. I
Ah,
never realized how significant that text is when it comes to mental health.
mhm,
It's almost, I'm rediscovering it here right now and looking at it. By the way, in case you're interested, it came from Lutheran theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who died in 1971, actually. So there you go. I thank you for this. I thank you for helping me rediscover this and for the very good advice. You'll have to come back on.
Would love to. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, going back to, we've always practiced something along those lines when it comes to anxiety, but it takes some different skills to manage when the world is feeling so chaotic. So, yeah, thank you for allowing me to come and talk about it. Honestly, it's a helpful refresh for me to sit and pause, and to reflect on what I might need to be doing in the face of all this news. So thank you.
For Ontario's school boards, the public and Catholic boards in Toronto, the Peel Board, and the Ottawa Carleton Board, have launched a $4.5 billion lawsuit against the operators of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Their claim: these platforms have been deliberately designed to manipulate the developing brain of students to promote excessive, compulsive, and unsafe use of their products. The developing brain of students. That says a lot. Dr. Emma Durden is a Canada Research Chair in Neuroscience and Learning Disorders, as well as an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University. And she looks at social media and its impact on the brains of young people. Is that a fair way to describe it, Doctor?
Yeah, we look at social media and other media screen time use, including video games, passive watching of videos, watching television, and how does it impact brain development, but then also how it's associated with children's learning memory ability, as well as their mental health.
You know what? You just brought up something. You just said watching television. And now I'm going back to my youth and thinking that was the big alarm. That was huge in my day about how television is rotting the brains of our children, and a lot of studies were put towards that. Is there a fair comparison to be made between the impact television had on us and that social media is having on our kids, or is it definitely apples and oranges?
Well, people have certainly looked at different media types in terms of on outcomes in children. And so, in a nutshell, I would say no. So, for television, even video games, the majority of video games undergo extensive editorial review. So for something like Teletubbies, those characters, while they kind of seemed so unusual, right? That all underwent,
You're being
extreme
kind, unusual,
vetting.
okay, with the Teletubbies, but go ahead.
Yeah, that was all. Yeah, so that was, that all underwent like approvals and so for social media, it's completely unregulated. So that's really the difference there.
The the talk about social media and this latest lawsuit from school boards, and this is the first in Canada. However, there are several already in place, similar in the U.S. How much validity is there to these accusations against social media companies that kids' brains just are not ready or equipped for social media? And we're going to get more into why they may or may not be in a moment.
Well, that's the silver bullet, right? It's demonstrating a causal association between social media and adverse mental health outcomes. So, in truth, we're not there yet. There's actually only been maybe just over 30 brain imaging studies that have examined this issue or looked specifically at social media and brain function, brain structure, not even really relating it to mental health. There have been longitudinal studies like ours where we followed children over time looking at their mental health in relation to media screen time use, including social media. And we showed that over time that there was an association between higher amounts of social media use, screen time use, and the risk for anxiety and depression in children. There's also been randomized controlled trials that have been conducted with teens. We actually can't really do a lot of those types of studies. So when I say randomized controlled trial, this is like a drug trial where there's somebody in the groups gets the drug and then somebody gets the placebo pill. And, we can't really do a lot of this research in children because we know that there is potential harmful effects of social media. So we can't really ethically have one group where we know we're subjecting children and teens to potentially adverse outcomes. So in that way, and this is true for a lot of research in development, right? We're limited in what we can do to show empirically causal effects by having a really tightly controlled study where you just have the exposure is the only thing that varies between the groups. So in terms of whether or not it is true, we know that there are a lot of social media accounts, right? And people, more than half of social media users report that they really enjoy using it, but yet also a significant report, they self-report that it is associated with higher levels of anxiety or even depression. So people do like it. There are some people who can be more impacted than others, and we kind of need to know about these risk factors. Because it's such a blunt force effect, that it calls for higher regulation and legislation in that given that there have been children who've had very, very serious, adverse outcomes from social media. Not all children and teens. There can be some benefits as well. It just really indicates that this is something that we really need to have tighter controls on, tighter awareness, more digital literacy, and just more protections for our children to protect their mental health.
Okay, neurons are a funny thing. We are just scratching the surface of knowing exactly how they operate. First of all, what is a neuron?
Neuron is a brain cell, so it's like any other cell in our body. It has multiple different parts, so it has kind of like a little body that is is waiting for information signals from other neurons, and it has a long tail. And the tail is how it goes and communicates with others. So the body makes up our brain's cortex, the gray matter, and those little tails all together, they make up the brain's white matter fiber pathways, which are like the brain's communication pathways. So your brain has millions and millions of neurons, and they have these little tails that allow connectivity between other brain regions. So other brain regions can talk to one another.
And we shape those neurons. What would you say would be more fair? We shape the neurons, or the neurons shape us?
Well, I guess it's a bit of both. Yeah, we have, brain cells that are developed, and occurs mainly according to a genetic pattern. But of course, there can be things in the environment that are going to influence that. And, things that what we do every day is going to impact neurons and the strength of their connections between other neurons. So if you play a lot of tennis, for example, or you play the piano, then, parts of your brain responsible for motor coordination, motor planning, that sort of thing, there's going to be changes there.
So what I'm getting at with this is that one way or the other, social media is going to have an impact on what's happening in our skull. So, what is happening when we are into something as much, almost compulsively, such as social media? What's happening up there, and what does it mean for our development?
Yeah, so just what I was saying before about, if you're playing a lot of tennis or something like that, or playing the piano, there's going to be changes in your brain. For a lot of the teens in our studies who are coming in, the average amount of time they're spending on social media per day is around 3 to 4 hours. So that's a lot of time, right? Time in a day is finite. There's not going to be any way to create more time in a day. And if you're spending the majority of it doing one thing, then there is going to be changes in the brain. So we know that social media impacts the brain in very specific ways. It namely acts on the brain's reward system. So the reward system develops very early on, and it's very active in childhood, right? So we all know it's very easy to get a child to change their behavior based on a reward. But in adolescence, they also have this active reward system, but there's other parts of our brain responsible for understanding thoughts and feelings in others, and those brain regions are very highly sensitive to things like likes and social comparisons, which is what social media is all about. And then lastly, we have the brain's cognitive control center, our frontal lobes. This is the part of our brain which helps us to manage expectations, monitor our feelings and emotions, and make inhibitory responses, right? So put the phone down. And this part of our brain is what develops last. So it develops really only in our late 20s or even early 30s. So in the teenage brain, that's really hardwired for rewards and is like out seeking gratification and, is really seeking sensational content online. They don't necessarily have the brain machinery to be able to put this down, like put it in context, because their frontal lobes haven't really caught up yet.
And that's interesting because here we talked earlier about politicians using these platforms and bombarding youth. And in that case, they can't just target to youth who are able to vote. They bombard people. And let's face it, people as young as 8, 9 years old are on social media. So what happens when they are bombarded by a message, and it's not always the truth, and that they sort of amplify that message, reposting it and moving it along, developing a political position, without even really getting all of the facts for this. So again, we have a brain that is being gratified, but at the same time, what kind of self-regulation do we have at that age in our brain?
Yeah, well, we know social media is infectious, right? It's designed to have these psychological triggers and mechanisms in place to keep us online, right? And for young people who are seeing information about state of the world, political events, this hasn't been really studied extensively empirically in research. However, we do know that exposure to kind of constant negative information, negative news, can have a significant impact on us. So, just as I noted before when I was talking about randomized controlled studies and somebody taking a placebo pill, so taking a placebo has been shown to have really strong effects. So if a doctor tells you you're getting this pill and it's going to make you feel better, then that sometimes is even more powerful than even taking the real medication. And that's the way our brains are designed. But at the same time, if a doctor says to you, I'm going to give you a pill and it's going to make you feel bad, it's going to make you sick, our brain mechanisms also kick in and it will actually amplify the pain response. So you actually will have physiological changes in the body. If the doctor gives you a pill and says you're going to feel good, then there's actually parts of our body we're able to release the very similar chemicals that are in something like morphine, like releasing opioids into our bodies, and it makes us feel good. And then similarly, we'll have an adverse reaction in terms of actual physiological changes, release of chemicals in our bodies that will actually make us feel bad. So our brains are hardwired to do this, and we're hardwired, right? And for the developing brain, this is even more concerning because it can be often, like in terms of managing expectations, that's often mediated by our frontal lobes, which aren't really developed in adolescence. So in turn, if they're hearing a lot of this negative information, it can be amplified, particularly in those individuals who maybe have anxiety, high levels of stress. We all know that we can easily misread information when we're in a high state of stress. We can, because it's often based on our perception. And for a young teen who doesn't really have the ability to regulate all of that, put it in context, then yeah, it could lead to, really amplification of negative thoughts, negative thinking, and in turn, those posts can be reshared even more, and just kind of feeding into that whole reward system. So it can really have a number of negative effects, which is really highlights in terms of why there should be more stricter regulations and guidelines for young people on social media.
So I know that the study is not done yet; it's still ongoing. Would you be able to share perhaps some initial, and let's make them a little bit more subjective thoughts from your part? Just something parents can try, or something that parents should realize about social media and its hold on their kids.
Yeah, so for our brain imaging studies that we're conducting now, so we look at the brain's connectivity. So just as I was saying about the neurons and the white matter fiber pathways and the other brain regions talking to one another, that's what we're looking at in our brain imaging studies in terms of how does social media and other media screen time use impact those connections. So we look specifically in terms of how does it impact the brain's cognitive control center in relation to the brain's social network. And what we see in really high social media users is that those brain regions aren't communicating efficiently with one another in comparison to children who use social media less. For other studies, our longitudinal studies where we followed children and families long term, looking at their mental health and screen time, what we found was that sleep was a major factor. Having proper sleep hygiene is really essential for healthy brain development. But what we found in our study was that those kids who are on screens for more time, they slept less. And with less sleep, it impacted their learning and memory abilities in terms of also how they were ability to regulate their emotions. And that could be placing them at risk for adverse mental health outcomes. So promoting healthy sleep habits, limiting screen use in bedrooms, limiting it 1 hour before bed to promote healthy sleep. Also, in a number of our studies, we've looked at factors like parenting, and we found that parent stress is actually really associated with children's screen time use. Children who are in households with highly stressed parents are more likely to spend time on screens, and parents who exhibit positive parenting practices, so involvement in their children's lives, supportive parenting, that was actually associated with less screen time use. So there are things that parents can do on the day-to-day, as well as for children and teens themselves, in terms of managing their sleep, managing their usage, looking at how many times, if they can look at their pickups on their phone, see how many times they're picking their phone up during the day, kind of limiting those pickups, limiting use, right? Putting down the phone and engaging in other activities, real life activities, instead of being online all the time. So instead of reading online, reading a book.
Okay, well, I guess I'm going to have a parenting expert on about how do you convince your kid to do that, because it's all well and good to say, get them away from the screen. But if you've ever tried, and I'm sure you have, it's another thing. So that can be challenging. But I think having the information is to arm yourself. If you can literally say to your kid, okay, here's a neuroscientist, and she is saying exactly what's happening in your brain, maybe a conversation could start there. That they're not just trying to be, jerks. They're looking out for the health of your child. But that's tough.
Yeah. Well, you know what? The largest number of tech-free schools is actually in Silicon Valley, right? That's where those tech heads send their kids. So maybe they know something we don't, right?
Really?
So I think for parents, we can make schedules and routines, right? At home, people do this all the time. Children thrive on schedules and routines. So it is possible to do for the cell phone bans that came out throughout Canada, in Alberta, in Nova Scotia, right? When they implemented it at schools, they said, yeah, you can't take your cell phone to school. There wasn't riots in the street. They just stopped doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So it is possible to make these simple changes. So we're not going to get rid of screens, right? I mean, like the toothpaste is out of the tube at this point, but it is possible to manage them, right? To manage screen use. As we are able to do as adults, right? But for teens and young people, they don't really have, that ability. And they're kind of this first generation, these digital nomads that are growing up entirely digital with, kind of no restrictions, no regulation. And yeah, we're kind of seeing it play out, right? That it's not associated, that it is associated with, higher levels of violence and issues with mental health. Not for everybody, but for a significant proportion, right? And even if those children aren't the majority, then for the ones that are affected, they still matter, right?
Indeed. Boy, we could talk for hours on this. In fact, I do want to have you back on. We can talk about this. We can talk about a number of other issues too, about the developing brain, because I think probably it's a fair statement to say you're almost discovering something new in neuroscience almost every day.
Yeah, I think that is a fair assumption. And we're, by taking this direction of studying the impact of digital technology on the brain, it's really been very eye-opening. We never took information about screen time, but now, we have teens coming in reporting that they're spending 15 hours on a weekend day on a screen the entire day. And this is just kind of going unnoticed, right? That there's, this is screen generation that's being raised out there. So, we're not really we kind of are seeing in the schools now, but, what are we going to see later on when these individuals are entering the workforce or not entering the workforce? Struggling at university, not being able to focus and concentrate and have critical thinking skills that it really takes to attend university and go into professional programs, right?
You can visit her website, developingbrain.ca. Thank you for this, Dr. Durden.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for having me on the show. Take care.
A 30-second break, and we're back with your call to action.
You know, kids have it so much easier these days than I did growing up.
Well, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association, adolescents today report higher rates of depression and anxiety than adults. In fact, suicide is a leading cause of death among adolescents. Ask your doctor about the Adolescent Inpatient Program at Ontario Shore Centre for Mental Health Science. Our specialized team provides holistic care and ensures you to stay on track with your schooling. Learn more at ontarioshores.ca/adolescents.
Now, if things weren't bad enough, here's something to think about. It's no longer us just seeking to doom scroll. The doom seeks us. We have programmed news alerts into our phones so that every time something happens, and it happens a lot during a day that things change, it taps us on the shoulder and grabs our attention and therefore grabs our anxiety levels. Now, an obvious call to action would be turn off these alerts. I just had another alert just come in right now, in fact. And that's not always practical. But then it hit me as I was speaking to Dr. Durden that the Serenity Prayer has never had more meaning than it does now in 2025. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. So here's your call to action. Print it out or copy and paste it somewhere. Put it somewhere that you are going to see it on your bulletin board, beside your night table. Use it as the wallpaper for your phone or for your laptop. Now, while this prayer does have its Lutheran and Christian roots, these are words that are relevant to any faith, to any belief system. They speak directly to what it means to be mindful. What can I control and what can't I control? If I can't control it, then I cannot add that to my anxieties. This is the very essence of mindfulness and being able to regulate your mood. And coming up on the next episode of the Mental Health Podcast, resilience. I'm going to be talking to a doctor who has made it her life's work to teach people how to be resilient, something very important with our mental health. We're going to talk to her about as well how an accident in which she had her car sink beneath the ice changed her life. That's next time on the Mental Health Podcast. Until then, thanks for joining me. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.